We're in last week of our series on engaging culture. By the way, next week we're starting a brand new series, and we're going to spend the remainder of the year looking at the book of Esther. It's an Old Testament book, so if you want to read ahead this week, read the story of Esther. It's going to be a lot of fun. The whole series is called For Such a Time as This, and so that's what we're going to be looking at, and it's going to be great. But today we're finishing a series, this Engaging the Culture series, and we did this because we were looking at a bunch of different social and cultural issues that we face today. The things you hear about in the media, the stuff you hear in the news, the stuff that you see posted on Facebook or on Twitter or wherever you're getting your information from. And what we said was, the reason we were looking at this is that we have this opportunity as Jesus followers to reflect the heart of God to this chaotic and crazy world. It's an opportunity. I see a lot of people not taking advantage of it. They seem to blend in, but we don't have to be that way. We actually get to people that reflect God's heart. And so the overarching principle that we had in this whole thing, and the thing that we're kind of working our way through with every single topic, is simply this, is that when we engage in the world, we want to ask this question: how can I love others as God through Christ has loved me? That is the thing. And if that isn't the filter through which we see it, then we are engaging wrongly. So we need to be doing this all the time. That's the lens. And so today we're going to finish with our last topic. On April 6th, 1994, a lot of us remember those days, a plane carrying the president of an African country was shot down. Opponents assassinated him by blowing his plane out of the sky. And it was a flashpoint. It was a trigger that erupted these decades of hostilities that have been simmering under the surface in this country. And beginning on April 7th, the next day, and extending for 100 days, the Hutu population of Rwanda carried out a systematic extermination of the other ethnic group in the country, the Tutsi population. People were shot, they were macheted to death, they were abused, they were raped, they were murdered. Husbands murdered wives. Priests and nuns killed people who came to shelter in their churches. And scholars estimate that in just over 3 months, in 100 days, 800,000 people were slaughtered. And while the reasons were wide and they were varied, a key part of this horrific tragedy was racism. And we're going to conclude our series by looking at the whole idea of racial and ethnic tension, which is such a flashpoint in our culture today. We're most familiar with this topic or this issue in our own country because that's where we live, that's what we're used to. We know that it started here when this country was colonized, right? We all know this. You took your history. There was the slave trade. The treatment of the Native Americans was just had an awful lot of shameful practices in them, sinful practices in them. But it's not just unique to here, right? This isn't just a modern invention in the United States. It's been around for a long time. Various segments of the European immigration population had issues when they came here. Do you remember in World War II, by the way? Remember when they interred Asian populations and German populations just because they had the wrong ethnicity? Even though they'd done nothing wrong? But this happened elsewhere. I mean, you guys know what's happened in Europe. The most recent and biggest example in Europe was, of course, Nazi Germany in World War II. They tried to exterminate an entire race of people based on their ethnicity and their race. But that was preceded by all kinds of nationalistic conflict, empire building on the backs of other nations, right? The British Empire, which stretched over India, Africa, and all these. And there's been wars throughout other parts of Europe, Macedonia, Albania. You know, there's a statue in Kosovo to Clinton because he actually helped end a horrific race war between that whole Albanian region. They love him there because he actually stepped in and helped one country defeat the other. In the Middle East, there's always tensions, isn't there? The whole West Bank, Palestine, the Arabs versus the Jews, there's just conflict and racial tension all the time. In the Far East, there's the Vietnamese versus the Cambodian versus the Chinese. There's racial tension, there's conflict, and they're always on the precipice of war. India and Pakistan never get along. They have these racially charged treatments between them. And this is all just in the last couple hundred years. Doesn't even count what happens in the long histories of dominant cultures destroying and subjugating other cultures, treating them as inferior or lesser. Now, most of us would read these stories, we read these histories, we're appalled by them. We're like, we don't even understand how these things could happen. We know it's wrong, we know it's not right, it's terrible. And yet when it comes to our own personal experience, doesn't a lot of that seem very, very far away? Right? It's not really, yeah, I read it, it's terrible, it's awful, but what does that have to do with me? The idea of these racial tensions and racism and race differences is one of those areas that most people I've met think the problem is with somebody else, not them. I'm not a racist. I'm good. I don't have a problem. I don't have any issues with this. This is other people. I mean, if they would just fill in the blank. But how we respond to this issue isn't always as clear-cut as I think we would like to think it is. And in our country, some would say that the church in America is as divided as ever over the issues of racial justice. And unfortunately, the church has had some horrible experience with this. If you look at history, you've had some terrible acceptance of racism with people using religion to actually resist things that would lift people up. But, and remember, this is a big however, a big but, is that the church has also been arguably the most powerful force in transforming racial injustice in a positive direction. So, what does that look like for us? And what are we going to do? So we're going to do it the same way we've done this entire series. I want to look at what the heart of God is at the issue. Then I want to look at why and how it broke. And then what does that mean for us? What do we do with all this? And we'll see where we end up with that. All right? So let's take a look at God's heart toward this whole idea of race and ethnicity. And like almost everything we've ever done in this whole series, we're going to begin with how God designed it in the first place. So let's go all the way back to the beginning and take a look. Genesis. In the account of creation, and we read this, and we've read this multiple times in this series. Then God said, let's make mankind in our image, in our likeness. We're going to make humanity like us, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. And so God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female. He created them. So this is the starting point. This is the jumping off point. Humanity was made in the image of God, right? I mean, doesn't matter. It's no exceptions. If you are human, you bear the stamp of the Almighty. You just do. That's how God designed it. You're valuable. You matter. God thinks the world of you because He made you. Now, we can't rush past this too quickly because our answer to this is what? Well, of course. Well, yeah, duh. That's true. But racism always, whether it's conscious or unconscious, has this root or this false sense of superiority over somebody else. That just this little kernel of, well, yeah, we don't say, well, they're not worth less, but the way they do things is kind of crazy. Like there's this sense of superiority, and right at the beginning, God says, nope, everybody made my image, equally valuable, because I designed them. And it's interesting because this carried out all the way through Scripture. God didn't design there to be any of these differences. Paul was writing and talking to this proud people, the Greeks, who at the time thought everybody who wasn't a Greek was a barbarian. They just thought we were the superior race. Everybody else doesn't have the culture we do. And Paul, when he's speaking to them, he says this. He's talking to this whole group of people, and he says, from one man, he, talking about God, made all the nations, that they would inhabit the whole earth. He marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. And why did God do this? He did this so that they would seek Him and perhaps reach out for Him and find Him, though He's not far from any of us. Now, Scripture is not clear on how all the ethnicities came into being. You know, a lot of people think it happened at the Tower of Babel, but we don't know that for sure. Scripture didn't deem it all that important to let us know how that happened. We don't know sure, but what we know is that all creation, all mankind, all humanity is valuable. And God, remember when God chose the Israelites, right, through Abraham, he said, okay, you're going to be my chosen people. He actually built into their laws that they were to be distinct, but it had nothing to do with their ethnicity. It had everything to do with their relationship to God. That's why they were distinct. They said, look, I chose you. You're my people because you have this relationship with me. And what I want you to do is be an example to the entire world so that it draws all people to me. That's why I'm picking you. Not because your race is better, because you know me. And probably the most powerful picture, and if you don't think this is consistent all the way through Scripture, think of the very beginning. This is how I designed it. And then we have this picture in Revelation of how it's all going to end. And after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count. And I love this picture. From every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they were wearing white robes, and they were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. All together, all praising, perfect unity, with equal value. It's going to be amazing. By the way, as a complete aside, when you picture that happening, what kind of music do you think it's going to be? Your kind? You know, we're the minority. What if God just went with the majority in the world and said, that's how heaven's music's going to look? It ain't going to look anything like you're used to. I don't know. I just think it's funny because most of us picture it in our own language and our own way of doing music. But anyway, at this point, most of you, if not all of you, because you're smart people, you are in total agreement with everything I've said so far, right? Absolutely. This makes sense. This is what God designed. Absolutely. Everybody's everybody's equal. It's the easy part. Because sin actually is what created disunity or division. We hear a critical story in the early church centered around Peter in regard to this whole issue. Because sin came in, broke it, made it so that there was now this sense of superiority, of disunity, of kind of people against each other simply because of what they looked like or their culture. If you remember this story, it's in the early church. The church is growing. It's growing rapidly, but it's growing with almost all Jewish people. So that was the start. It was all Jewish people because Jews were taught not to associate with anybody who was a non-Jew. Right? That was this was both a cultural thing. In other words, you just didn't do that. Like, we stay with our people. We don't do anything with the other people. But it wasn't only cultural. It was theological. It was built into their faith system that said, God doesn't let us. He doesn't want us to. When we connect with people who aren't Jews, we're risking something in terms of our relationship with God. We don't want to do this. And so the church, it's growing like crazy. Peter preaches this message. Thousands of people are coming to Jesus. They're almost all Jewish people. But Cornelius is a Roman centurion, right? The guy's in charge. He's a Roman centurion, so he's a non-Jew. In fact, he's in charge of soldiers who tend to not necessarily be good to non-Jews or to Jews. So he's part of that whole establishment, but he is a God-centered guy. He loves God. He's seeking God. He wants to find him. And so he gets this vision where God says, I want you to go send for this Peter guy. So he says, okay, I'm going to do that. And if you remember the story, it's in Acts chapter 10. At the very same time he's talking to Cornelius, he's giving Peter a vision. Do you remember this vision? And so Peter's sitting up there, he's meditating, he's praying. It actually says it was in advance of dinner, so he's probably hungry, okay? And so he has this vision, and this sheet comes down with heaven, has all this food on it. But the problem is, it's all kinds of food that Jews were not supposed to eat, because again, in their culture, these were unclean. And the voice from heaven says, hey, Peter, eat up. Peter's like, no, I'm not going to do that, God. That is not the right thing to do. You said we're not supposed to do that. And do you remember what the voice says? Don't call unclean anything that I have called clean. And this happens 3 times. And of course, because God is a master at this, the third time the sheet goes up to heaven, there's a knock at the door, right? And there's a messenger saying, hey, there's this Roman guy, this centurion, he wants you to come. And Peter's not that stupid. He's like, oh, these 2 things are connected. Okay, all right, I'll come with. And so he comes with them. And you have to understand, this was a huge breach of etiquette, of culture, of theology. He's a leader in the church, right? This is your local, pastor over multiple churches making a decision that he's saying, I don't know what everybody's going to think about this. But he goes. And as he's sharing the good news with Cornelius, which, by the way, if you read the story, it's hilarious because he's a condescending racist even as he shares the gospel. I'm not even supposed to be here. Jews aren't even supposed to associate with Gentiles. But here's what God told me. Like, it's just really in-your-face stuff. But Peter's like, all right, as best his ability, he does it. And the Holy Spirit comes on the whole room. People begin to speak in tongues and praise God. And it blew Peter away. But it drove home what he just said. Here's what he said. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. This is one of the disciples, for crying out loud. This isn't someone from an edge thing. I mean, he's the core person. And it took this supernatural invention for him to realize, no, everybody is equally loved by God. And Peter ended up having to explain this. He had to defend himself to the rest of the church. He had to come back and say, look, not my idea, God's idea. All right, I'm just being obedient. If you have a problem, then talk to God. But this problem kept coming up. It was actually an issue in the church. This whole thing we're facing right now is not new. It was a constant issue. All you have to do is read through Paul's letters. Paul's writing to churches all the time. To the Galatian church, he says, look, there's neither Jew nor Greek. There's not slave or free. There's no male and female. You're all one in Christ. He's basically saying, look, stop with the racism stuff. It doesn't exist. We're one people. Writing to the Romans, he says there's no distinction between Jew and Greek, Jew and non-Jew. For the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. Everybody who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. There's no exceptions. He's writing to the Colossian church. He says here, there is not Greek and Jew, not circumcised and uncircumcised, not barbarians or Scythians or slaves or free. He says, look, it's all in one, God. We know this, don't we? I mean, this isn't new information. We believe this. Christ is for all, died for all, everybody's equally valuable. And then George Floyd died. And protests erupt around the country. And suddenly there is division and animosity everywhere, including in the church. People of color said they thought everything that we ever thought about racism, just got proved. We have systematic disadvantages. Black Lives Matter became a rallying cry to state that all lives should be treated equally. Other people reacted to that. The protests were just excuses to riot. Black Lives Matter is all about Marxist ideology. It should be rejected. We should protect our police. So now Blue Lives Matter, which created another reaction. The centrists tried to say all lives are matter, and everybody ignored them because they said, you're not even taking a stand. Do you see what happens? All these are reactions and counter-reactions and counter-reactions and counter-reactions. And when someone disagrees with what our reaction is, then we go back and it just goes on and on and on. And while there's tremendous value in having these discussions about the Black Lives Matter movement or on critical race theory or on policing practices, they ignore the primary problem, which means we miss the solution. Racism, racial tension, is rooted in sin and selfishness. Period. It's actually not rooted in our particular ethnicity. It's not a particular race. No one has the corner on this. It's rooted in our sinful nature. Sin and selfishness that says, and when we don't live in a right relationship with God, you can't live in a right relationship with other people. It doesn't work. And since our hearts are very deceitful, right? We know that. Scripture tells us our hearts are deceitful. It can actually be very, very difficult to see this in ourselves. So how do we identify? I mean, sin's broken, it's created problems. We know because we've seen it recently how this comes up in the church. How do we even tell? Like, you're all sitting here thinking, well, that's great. I wish someone else was here to see this or hear this, but I don't really have any problems with this. I just love everybody. I wish our church was more multi-ethnic. I'm just a loving person. I love everybody. We even accept Canadians. All right. Barely, that's right. So let me ask you a couple diagnostic questions. Maybe you'll find them helpful. to wonder if this is something you need to be praying about. Do I make generalizations about groups of people based on their ethnicity? And this can so easily happen. We speak about a group of people and we assume that they're a certain way, right? Well, that group's always, they're a hardworking group. Well, that group's really quiet. They don't say much. That group's obnoxious. Or that group's really good at athletics. Or that one's really good at math and sciences. Or that one, they're just troublemakers. And if you say, I don't think any of that, then ask yourself this question. If it was 10:30 at night and you were walking down the street, and on your side of the sidewalk, 5 young men, all under the age of 18, were walking towards you, would you react and respond and think the same? If it was 5 white kids, 5 Hispanic kids, 5 black kids, 5 Asian kids. And if the answer to your question is, and you have to be honest, no, there's an issue. Because we stereotype people even when we say good things about people. Oh, they're just, that group of people, that race, they're just such hard workers. And you're like, oh, what are you doing? They're like, what? I'm saying good things about them. I'm not stereotyping. Yeah, you are. A good stereotype is still a stereotype. Nobody likes to be typecast. You don't like it. Nobody does. That's question number 1. Here's the second one. Do I find myself defending the way I do and think? In other words, is the way I view the world more rational or better or smarter than the way other people do it? I didn't know I did this till I had a friend and became good friends with someone who was not in my ethnicity. And I'll never forget, I think I've told the story to a couple of you, we got invited over for dinner. It was the first time we'd gone out for dinner in restaurants and so on, but this is the first time my wife and I got invited to their house for dinner. Sunday afternoon, we said this would be great, right? It's going to be very different. He's going to cook for us. And they said, well, come around 3 o'clock. And we thought, okay, we don't really want to be exactly on time. We're not entirely sure how they'll do that. So we kind of slid in a little casually after 3. When we pulled in at 3, she was still working in the yard. He hadn't even started anything. And they came in and said, oh, hold on a second. We still got to shower and get ready. You guys can just sit in the living room. And we sat in the living room in a house we'd never been in before. Well, they spent 45 minutes getting ready, looking at each other going, what is going on here? Right? This was the weirdest thing I've ever encountered. And of course, what's your first thought is, well, that was really inconsiderate. I can't believe they did that. I know that because I know we rent our church out to other ethnicities, and I've had conversations with some of you, and their view of time is not the same as ours. Do you know that European cultures measure time very differently? They tend to be fixated on time. We measure things according to the clock and according to tasks and according to productivity. There are many cultures that their time is based on relationships. It's literally how they see time. And so each event or activity has a natural beginning and a natural end, and it's whenever the people are there. And we think, well, that's just stupid, right? And we can be critical. And when someone says, well, I don't know, that doesn't mean your way is better, we say, oh, yes, it is. That's just inconsiderate. That's just wrong. I've heard American tourists say, why can't they just speak English? Or why don't they just use American money? Do you realize how condescending and racist that is? If anything, if someone questions anything and it starts bumping up against me and I immediately begin to defend, that's a problem. When the George Floyd thing happened and all this stuff began to explode, do you know what a lot of Christ followers did? The first thing they did was begin to defend. Oh, hold on, that's not right, that's not good, you're missing the point, the police are actually on our side, and everything was pushed back, and there was no desire to understand, just to defend. Easy to do. How about this one? Am I critical, or do I find humor at the expense of another people group? Doesn't matter if it's jokes, references, words, they expose a heart that does not see people the way Jesus does. And anything that demeans or runs them down is a problem. And here's a fourth problem. These all apply to everybody, by the way, but the fourth one is a unique one to Christ followers. Do I look down on the theology and church practice of others? Because what we end up doing when we're defending and we're critical, we don't want to be defensive and critical, so the first thing we do is we find a theological reason why they're wrong. You know how they do church? Yeah, I don't know if that's a New Testament thing. I think the way we do it's better. I mean, after all, the way the Germans figured out and the Northern Europeans, that must be how God designed church to be run. How they worship, how they pray, how they connect, how they teach. It's just not really biblical. The titles, the positions they have in their church, that's just wrong. Do you know that there's an interesting dynamic? You won't see this, but among pastors, and this is new. I've noticed this in the last 5 years. There's a new metric when pastors meet about whether you have a good church or not. When you were 20 years ago or 10 years ago, when I got into this, 20 years ago, the first question was always, well, how big's your church? Right? There's something about the size of your church. How many people are in the pews? You know, in budgets, they always called it, people in the seats and dollars in your budget, right? Those are the things. And they kind of worked really hard to eradicate that. So do you know what the question is now? How multi-ethnic is your church? Because there's something noble about being multi-ethnic. Again, probably birthed from a good place. I'm not saying it's bad, but I wonder if we've missed the point. If we're all designed by God, we're loved by Him, we're invited into His kingdom, with all the eccentricities and cultural foibles that go with all of us, how do we live into being a people that actually drives racial unity? And I was hoping to have our police chief here this morning, wasn't able to make that work, because he can speak to how that is not true in our town. There isn't unity. Not yet. It's coming. It's a long way to go. So how do we become agents of reflecting the heart of God to the world around us? What do we do? One of the best teachings of this comes from Paul, and it's in Philippians. And here's what I would say. Maybe it sounds a little impractical, or maybe you're not sure, but we're going to try and put handles on this. But I think we get through this by loving others, by considering their perspective. Here's what Paul wrote to the Philippians. He said this, therefore, in other words, he's kind of making a connection. Everything he's been talking about before, he says, look, because of everything I've just written you, I want you to understand, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from His love, any common sharing in the Spirit, in other words, if you are being the church, any tenderness and compassion, then here's what I want you to do, church. I want you to make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit, one mind. And then he says this, do nothing out of selfish ambition, a lot of you know this off by heart, or vain conceit, but in humility consider others above yourselves. In other words, the way they do it, the way they think, the way they live, put that in your brain first before your stuff. Don't look to your own interests, but each to the interests of others. In your relationships with each other, have the same mindset as Jesus. And then he goes on in this very famous passage to describe the mindset Jesus had of becoming one of us. So how do we do that? That's really what Paul's saying. He says, you want to do this right? This is how you treat each other. If we want to get past these racial tensions and all this stuff that's going on, what do we do at an individual level? Because let's be honest, a lot of us in most of these can't affect national policy, but we can affect how we do it. Because what we do matters. It's just simply not good enough to just say, all right, yeah, the Bible says we're all equal. Yeah, I believe that. All right, I'm good to go. There's a difference between a truth you know up here and a truth that you live into. And we know this. I mean, think about it. If you're in a church and a marriage is struggling, what you don't say is, oh, you just need to apply the gospel to your marriage. You're good. What do? We give practical ideas. What does that look like? What does it mean to bring the gospel to bear? If you're going to bring that into your marriage, how does it get better? What do? We want to come alongside and help. This is no different. We can't just say, well, the gospel says we're all equal. All right, we're good. No. How do we do this? How do we understand this? Because this whole idea of racial justice, it's not the gospel, but it is a huge indicator of the gospel working itself out in our lives. So what does this look like? When I look at this, I see a couple things. Here's the first one. Seek to understand before you defend. Right? This whole idea of Paul saying, you know what, I want you to consider others' interests. This is the idea of saying, before you get defensive about what you do, what you think, your viewpoint, be curious. Practice being curious people. Ask questions. Consider why someone says what they say and why they think what they think. And this is a practiced skill. This does not come naturally because we all have this tendency to filter the world through our own culture and our own experience, which, by the way, is fine because you can't filter through someone else's. You can only filter through your own experience. So when we interact with the world, it's based on everything we see, what we've experienced, our life, our past, our family, our jobs, our community. That's our filter. That's okay, but it can't stop there because we can make a greater attempt, like Paul says, to understand things from a different perspective. Stop assuming that you know what they're thinking and why they do what they do. When the BLM protests were at their worst, was your first reaction to understand it, to discuss it, or to come up with reasons why it was wrong? Paul says, Jesus put himself in our shoes. He became like us. And he's saying, that's what I want you to do. Because honestly, it's only when you begin to understand someone that you begin to have that biblical empathy for people and this desire to love them. You only do that by asking questions and by getting to know. And if you don't have a single person who's not in your ethnicity that you can have this discussion with, then find somebody. And in the meantime, keep your opinions to yourself. You don't love me very much right now, do you? Here's number 2. Don't confuse cultural disagreement or discomfort with sin. Have you ever considered that the way we do church and our beliefs about how to do church are largely cultural? And that even the way we understand our ecclesiology, how the Alliance sets up and how we do things in church, is cultural? And if that kind of sits wrong with you, you're like, no, we just do things what the Bible says. Let me give you a couple examples. I was doing a training a long time ago in Africa, and we were doing a training, and they had this worship time and an offering time at the beginning of the service. And if you went with a Western viewpoint of offerings, how do we do offerings? Very low key, right? It's not supposed to be showy. This is between you and God. Don't let the right hand know what the left hand's doing, right? We make our commitments. We live up to them. Do you know what? Because our reward's in heaven. Do you know what they did? They had music. They had the basket in the front, and everybody danced up the aisle with their offerings raised in their hand to put them in the basket before they went back. And if that were to happen here, we'd be like, whoa, that's a little showy. Like, I don't know, you're kind of bragging, you're kind of showing off. It was an amazingly beautiful expression of people who said, what I have is God's. Very different. Or how about this one? Titles. In a lot of African American churches, they use titles like apostle or bishop. And I've seen some, and I remember because I was convicted on this in my own heart. A lot of times there's times where they have honored parking spaces. They get referred to by their titles. And our fundamentalist theology says, you can't do that. There's no apostles anymore. It was just the 12 apostles. You can't call someone an apostle. What's a bishop? You're not Catholic. And we take everything we've learned and we project it, fully missing the way that particular culture honors their leaders and the language that they use to talk about their pastors. It is very easy to take all of our prejudices and our preferences and make them biblical. And if we don't like how someone else does church, we dismiss them that way. That's what Peter did until God said, pay attention. It ain't all about you. Here's number 3. Engage with other people and situations that might make you uncomfortable. If we want to be people who lean into this and who do this well, then never lean out from or walk away from opportunities to engage with people who aren't like you. That whole, when Paul's writing, say, look, I want you to consider others before yourself. I want you to serve them. I want you to be looking at things from their perspective. That means you have to lean in. It means we don't avoid, we don't ignore. We're open, we're building relationships. Racism is overcome by allowing God to confront personal prejudices and preferences that you don't even know you have. And I'm no different. It's why when we do things in this town and why we're trying to partner with more churches, we're saying, look, ethnicity doesn't matter. The kingdom matters. We want to do that. So get involved. And here's the last one. Never stay silent when word or action is required. We, as followers of Jesus, should never be silent when someone makes a joke at the expense of another ethnicity. We should never stand idly by while someone is taken advantage of because of the color of their skin. And we should be speaking up on behalf of those who are taken advantage of. We should be advocates for them. And what's interesting to me is number 4 does not happen if we're not doing 1, 2, and 3. But if we're doing 1, 2, and 3, 4 will happen every single time. Interesting. Remember, the overriding principle in this entire series is to love other people by living the law of Christ. Loving other people the way God through Christ loved us. And if every single person in the church lived this out with regards to other races and other ethnicities and other cultures, we would be so different in our community. There was a lady, she was doing ministry years ago. You can actually find her online. And after the service, she was approached by a man who looked very burdened and very troubled. And after a while, they began to talk, and he told her this story. Some of you may have heard this, but I think it's really powerful. This is a while ago, because this man said, I lived in Germany during the Nazi Holocaust. I consider myself a Christian. I attended church since I was a small boy, and we had started to hear stories of what was happening to the Jews, but like most people today in this country, we tried to distance ourselves from the reality of what was taking place, because what could anybody do to stop it? Well, there was a railroad track that ran behind our small church, and each Sunday morning we would hear the whistle from a distance and the clacking of the wheels as the train came by over the track. We became disturbed when one Sunday we noticed cries coming from the train as it passed. And we grimly realized that the train was carrying Jews. They were like cattle in the cars. Week after week, the whistle would blow, and we would dread to hear the sound of the wheels because we knew the Jews would be crying out to us as they passed our church. It was so terribly disturbing. We could do nothing to help these miserable people, yet their screams tormented us. But we knew exactly what time the whistle would blow, and so we decided the only way to keep from being disturbed was to start singing our hymns. And by the time the train came rumbling past the church, we were singing at the top of our voices. Because if some of the screams reached our ears, we'd just sing a little louder until we couldn't hear them anymore. Years have passed, and no one talks about it much anymore. But I still hear that train whistle in my sleep. I can still hear them crying out for help. God forgive all of us who called ourselves followers of Jesus and did nothing. We don't get to stand on the sidelines. So, like we've done every week, 3 questions to consider. If you want to process this alone with God this week or in the weeks ahead, I would encourage you to do so. First question, where do you find yourself getting the most defensive when it comes to racial issues and racial tension? If you're feeling defensive right now, it's something to talk to God about. I don't agree with you. I don't feel like I have to, I'm not like that. Defensiveness is almost always a sign that there's something God can work on in your heart. Number 2, with whom do you find yourself most naturally acting with biases, partiality, or prejudices? This is one of those things you have to be really honest, and it's probably safest to do this with God first because He knows anyway. I didn't recognize my prejudices with Native people till I left Canada. And I came to the U.S. and I thought, why do you guys have this really preoccupation with racism and black people and all this? I didn't understand it because we didn't have any where I grew up. Until I started realizing that all those same thoughts were the same thoughts I had with the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. And I realized, I got some work to do. Question number 3, what has prevented you from speaking up or engaging in this issue? What is it? Is it the fact that you don't think it's right, that you're defending something else, you just don't want to? No opportunity? I don't know. Ask God to help you lean into that. I realize this is a heavy topic to end this series on, but I am so convinced that if we as a church, in all these issues, whether it's sexuality or racial tensions or family or the environment or whatever it is we've talked about, if we said, look, the filter through which I do everything is going to be how can I love them the way God through Christ loved me, it will change how we live. And people will notice.